Imagine waking up one morning, looking outside your bedroom window, and realizing that your entire neighborhood is no longer in your city. The houses are still there, the streets are still there, your car is still sitting in the driveway. Your family is still inside the house, but everything beyond your front yard has changed. There are no neighbors, there are no police cars, there are no roads leading back to civilization. Instead, there is a prehistoric jungle. And somewhere beyond the trees, something enormous is watching you. That is the nightmare at the center of the end of Oak Street, one of the strangest and most unexpected science fiction movies of 2026. At first glance, it sounds almost ridiculous. Take a normal suburban street, throw an ordinary family into it, add dinosaurs, time travel, a mysterious cosmic event, and a filmmaker known for psychological horror, and somehow you get a movie that feels like it could have come straight out of the golden age of Hollywood adventure films. But that strange combination is exactly what makes this movie so interesting. The End of Oak Street is not simply a dinosaur movie, it is not simply a science fiction movie, and it is definitely not just another giant creature blockbuster where people run around screaming while computer generated monsters destroy buildings. At its heart, this is a story about a family that is already falling apart before the impossible happens. The dinosaurs are terrifying, but the family problems are real. The time travel is impossible, but the fear of losing someone you love is completely human. And the biggest surprise of the entire movie is that the film eventually becomes less about escaping dinosaurs and more about finding a way back to each other. That emotional idea is what gives the movie its power. And if you have only seen the trailers, there is a lot you probably still do not know because for months Warner Brothers deliberately kept this movie mysterious. Before audiences knew the real title, the movie was known as Flowervale Street. The story was kept secret, and that secrecy created endless theories online. Some people thought it might secretly be connected to Cloverfield, others wondered whether J. Abrams was preparing another mystery box science fiction franchise. Some fans even believed the movie could have connections to other stories about strange cosmic events. The truth turned out to be much more straightforward but also much more unusual. A suburban neighborhood is ripped away from its normal reality and transported into a prehistoric world, and suddenly the safest place imaginable becomes one of the most dangerous places on earth. The movie comes from David Robert Mitchell, the filmmaker behind The Myth of the American Sleepover and the acclaimed horror movie It Follows. That alone made this project interesting. Mitchell had spent years building a reputation for atmosphere, tension, strange ideas, and stories where ordinary environments suddenly become deeply unsettling. Then he disappeared from the director's chair for years, and when he finally returned, he did not come back with a small horror movie. He came back with dinosaurs. That is probably one of the funniest ways to describe the journey of this film. David Robert Mitchell went from making unsettling horror about an invisible supernatural threat to making a movie where an entire suburban neighborhood gets dropped into the age of dinosaurs. And somehow, the connection between those ideas actually makes sense because Mitchell has always been interested in taking ordinary spaces and making them feel unsafe. A bedroom can become frightening, a swimming pool can become frightening. A quiet street can become frightening, and in the end of Oak Street, the entire neighborhood becomes the horror setting. The film stars Anne Hathaway as Denise Platt and Ewan McGregor as Greg Platt. Their children Audrey and Brian are played by Maisie Stella and Christian Convery. The supporting cast includes Chris Coy, Jordan Alexa Davis, and PJ Byrne. The casting is one of the film's strongest decisions. Anne Hathaway brings something very important to Denise. She does not play her like a traditional action hero. Denise is not introduced as someone who knows how to survive in the wilderness. She is not carrying a giant weapon. She is not trained to fight dinosaurs. She is a mother dealing with a family that is already under enormous emotional pressure, and then the world completely collapses around her. That gives Hathaway the opportunity to play fear in a much more believable way. There are moments when Denise looks genuinely overwhelmed by what is happening, and that is important because a movie like this can easily become silly. If every character immediately accepts the dinosaur situation and starts acting like an action hero, the audience stops believing in the story. But Denise reacts like a normal person. She is frightened, she is confused, she is angry. She is trying to protect her children and slowly she becomes stronger. That transformation becomes one of the emotional foundations of the movie. Ewan McGregor's Greg is different. Greg is also trying to hold his family together, but his relationship with Denise has already become complicated. Their marriage is not in a perfect place, and the movie uses the disaster to force them into a situation where they cannot simply walk away from each other. That is one of the clever ideas hidden inside the movie. The cosmic event does not just destroy the family's normal life, it removes every distraction. Suddenly, there is no job to worry about, no school, no bills, no traffic, no neighbors. No ordinary arguments, there is only survival. And when survival becomes the only thing that matters, the characters are forced to confront what they actually mean to each other. That is why the dinosaurs work better when they are not on screen every second. The movie understands that suspense comes from waiting. A dinosaur does not have to appear immediately. Sometimes you only hear something, sometimes you see trees moving. Sometimes you see a shadow, sometimes you see the reaction on a character's face, and suddenly your imagination becomes more frightening than the creature itself. That style fits David Robert Mitchell perfectly. The production itself was surrounded by mystery almost from the beginning. In 2023, Warner Brothers announced that Mitchell was developing an untitled movie with J.J. Abrams and Hannah Minghella producing through Bad Robot, alongside producers from Jackson Pictures. Anne Hathaway was attached early in the development process. Oscar Isaac was later reported to be in talks for the project, but he eventually did not join the film. Ewan McGregor ultimately came aboard instead. Maisie Stella and Christian Convery joined soon afterward. This casting change is one of those small behind the scenes details that becomes much more interesting after seeing the finished movie. It is difficult now to imagine anyone other than McGregor playing Greg because his personality gives the character a strange combination of warmth and vulnerability. McGregor has played heroes, villains, fathers, soldiers, criminals, kings, and broken men. Here he is playing something much more ordinary, a husband, a father, a man who realizes that his family may be slipping away from him, and then he is placed in a world filled with dinosaurs. That contrast is what makes his performance work. The film was initially known as Flowervale Street, a title that sounded mysterious enough to make people wonder what the movie actually was. When that title was announced, almost nobody outside the production knew the full story. The secrecy was intentional. Warner Brothers and the filmmakers did not immediately reveal that dinosaurs were a major part of the movie. That decision was important because the first trailer became a major conversation point. The teaser arrived in March 2026 and finally showed audiences what the strange project was really about. The official material described a mysterious cosmic event that rips Oak Street away from suburbia and transports the neighborhood somewhere unknown. The first reaction from many viewers was basically the same. What did I just watch? And honestly, that was probably exactly the reaction the studio wanted because concept is almost impossible to explain without sounding like a joke. Imagine someone pitching it in a meeting. Okay, so we have a family in the suburbs. Good. Then their entire neighborhood gets transported somewhere else. Interesting. Then they discover dinosaurs. Wait, what? Then we make it emotional. That is basically the movie, but there is a reason it works. The filmmaker understood that the best high concept movies are often built around extremely simple ideas. What if an ordinary family had to survive in the dinosaur age? That is the hook. You do not need 10 complicated explanations. You do not need a massive cinematic universe. You do not need a pre existing franchise. You just need to make the audience believe that the characters are in danger. The film's production took place primarily in London and Atlanta, with principal photography beginning in March 2024 and wrapping in June of that year. That means there was a remarkably long period between filming and release. For the audience, the movie appeared suddenly in 2026. For the filmmakers, however, this had been a long journey, and that long production period makes sense when you consider the visual effects involved. You cannot simply put a dinosaur behind a house and call it finished. The movie had to create a believable world in which modern suburban America and prehistoric Earth could exist in the same frame. That meant production design became extremely important. Maya Shimoguchi served as production designer while Michael Julokis handled cinematography. John Axelrad edited the film, Aaron Benak designed the costumes, and Michael Giacchino composed the music. The cinematography is particularly important because the movie depends heavily on the contrast between familiar and unfamiliar. The opening sections feel like a normal suburban drama: houses, driveways, cars, family rooms, street corners. Everything feels safe, then the environment changes. The same houses are suddenly surrounded by prehistoric wilderness. The same streets that once carried school buses and family cars become paths through a dangerous ecosystem. That visual transformation is one of the film's strongest ideas. The movie essentially turns suburbia into a jungle, and that makes the title itself more interesting. The end of Oak Street does not simply mean the end of a physical road. It can also represent the end of normal life, the end of routine, the end of safety, the end of the world the characters understood. That is why the title becomes more meaningful after watching the movie. It is not just about a street, it is about a way of life disappearing. And there is another reason the film feels different from many modern blockbusters. It has a strong 1980s identity. The story is set in the early 1980s, which immediately gives the movie a different atmosphere. There are no smartphones, no modern internet, no instant communication, no GPS, no social media. That is extremely important. Imagine being transported into a prehistoric world today. You might still have a smartphone. You might have satellite communication, you might have maps, you might have emergency apps. But the characters in The End of Oak Street have none of those advantages. They are trapped with the technology of their time. That makes the situation more frightening. And it also allows the movie to borrow the feeling of classic 1980s adventure films. There is a reason critics have repeatedly compared the film's atmosphere to the era of Amblin style movies. The movie feels like something that could have existed decades ago, but with modern visual effects, that nostalgic quality is intentional. It wants you to remember the feeling of sitting in a theater and watching an ordinary family discover something extraordinary. But the movie does not simply copy those older films. David Robert Mitchell brings his own darker sensibility. He lets scenes breathe. He allows silence. He does not always rush from one dinosaur attack to another. And that is probably one of the biggest reasons the movie has received a surprisingly strong critical response. At the time of writing, The End of Oak Street sits at 86% on Rotten Tomatoes from more than 200 critic reviews, while the audience score is lower but still positive. Rotten Tomatoes describes the film as a creature feature adventure carried by a light touch and a sharp bite. That difference between critics and audiences is interesting. Some viewers absolutely love the movie, others think the story is too simple. Some people think the emotional ending works beautifully, others think the final act is too convenient. And that disagreement is exactly the kind of thing that can keep a movie alive online because the movie gives people something to argue about. Was the ending too emotional? Was it too predictable? Did the time travel explanation make sense? Should Greg really have survived? Was the 1980s setting necessary? Were there enough dinosaurs? Did the movie need more action? These questions have already become part of the conversation, and then there is the biggest spoiler of them all, Greg's death. If you have not watched the movie yet, this is the point where you may want to stop reading. Because one of the film's biggest emotional surprises involves Greg confronting an Allosaurus while trying to protect Denise. It is not simply an action scene, it is a sacrifice. Greg appears to give his life so that his family can survive. And for a moment, the movie appears to be heading toward a genuinely tragic ending. What makes the scene even more interesting is what happened behind the scenes. The filmmakers originally planned for Greg's death to be permanent, but during production, the ending was changed so that Greg could eventually return. Ewan McGregor and Anne Hathaway later discussed the change publicly, with McGregor describing the dinosaur sequence as physically demanding and emotionally strange to film. Hathaway was initially uncertain about changing the ending, but ultimately appreciated the emotional response it produced. That decision is fascinating because it changes the entire meaning of the ending. If Greg had remained dead, the movie would have finished as a much darker story about sacrifice. Instead, the final version chooses hope, and that is very important. The movie is basically saying that sometimes people need to lose something before they understand how much it matters. Denise and Greg begin the story with problems in their relationship. They are not presented as a perfect couple. But after everything they experience, the possibility of losing Greg changes Denise completely. The prehistoric world becomes a strange emotional test. The family must literally fight for the chance to remain a family. That is why the final reunion matters. It is not simply the dad comes back. It is the movie giving its characters a second chance to appreciate each other, a second chance to fix what was broken, a second chance to go home. And this is where the movie becomes more sentimental than some viewers expected. The dinosaurs may be the marketing hook, but the family is the real story. That is also why Anne Hathaway's performance has received significant praise. She has one of those roles where the character needs to sell both the spectacular and the emotional. One minute she has to react to something impossible. The next minute she has to play a mother terrified that her children are going to die. Then she has to deal with grief, then determination, then hope, and Hathaway manages to move between those emotions without making Denise feel like a superhero. She remains a person that matters because the more believable the human reaction is, the more believable the fantasy becomes. And the movie's dinosaurs are obviously a huge part of the experience. The visual effects team had to make prehistoric creatures feel physically present in suburban environments. That is harder than it sounds. A dinosaur standing in a completely digital jungle is one thing, a dinosaur standing beside a family home is something else. The audience knows what a suburban house looks like, they know how big a car is, they know how wide a road is. They understand scale, so the dinosaur has to feel like it actually exists in that physical environment. The production uses that scale to create some of its best suspense. A creature does not need to destroy an entire city. Sometimes seeing a giant animal standing quietly behind an ordinary house is more disturbing. It reminds you how helpless these people really are. The suburban setting also creates some darkly funny moments because these are normal people. They have normal problems. They react to prehistoric monsters with the same emotional confusion that somebody might react to a broken water heater, except the water heater is not trying to eat them. That contrast gives the movie its humor. And the humor prevents the film from becoming emotionally exhausting. There are moments when the movie knows how ridiculous its premise is. It does not completely play everything with a straight face. That balance is one of its biggest strengths. The music is another major part of the experience. Michael Giacchino composed the score, bringing his experience from films such as Jurassic World, The Incredibles, Ratatouille, Up, Rogue One, The Batman, and many other major productions into this strange combination of family drama and dinosaur survival. The score was recorded at the Warner Brothers Eastwood scoring stage, with Giacchino producing the score. Giacchino's music has to do two very different things. It needs to make the world feel magical, but it also needs to make it terrifying. The result is a score that often feels adventurous before becoming darker. That combination is exactly right for the movie because the story is not pure horror, it is not pure comedy, it is not pure adventure, it moves between all three. The music helps hold those different tones together. There is also a deliberate nostalgic quality to the soundtrack. The movie wants to feel like an adventure from another era, but it still needs the scale of a modern theatrical blockbuster. That is where Giacchino becomes extremely useful. He understands both sides. He can write music that sounds enormous when dinosaurs appear, but he can also create intimate emotional themes for a family sitting together in a quiet room. And the score has become enough of a talking point that it even received a vinyl release with new prehistoric themed artwork. That might sound like a small detail, but it says something about the movie's overall identity. This film was designed as an experience, not just content, not just another streaming title. It was made to be watched in a theater. The large screen matters, the sound matters, the dinosaur scenes benefit from the scale. And the quiet scenes also benefit because the audience is forced to sit with the characters rather than checking a phone every few minutes. Warner Brothers released the film internationally beginning August 12, 2026, with the North American theatrical and IMAX release arriving on August 14. That timing placed the film directly in the middle of a huge summer movie season, and the competition was intense. One of the biggest obstacles was Spider Man. Brand New Day which was dominating the box office. Then there was another dinosaur movie entering the market at almost exactly the same time, Pay Patrol, the Dino movie. So, yes, in 2026, audiences were basically asked to choose between different kinds of dinosaur entertainment. One movie offered dinosaurs with Anne Hathaway and Ewan McGregor, the other offered dinosaurs with the W Patrol characters. That sounds like a joke. But it was a real box office battle, and The End of Oak Street managed to win the weekend race between the two dinosaur movies domestically, earning roughly $21 million compared with about $20.5 million for Paw Patrol, the Dino movie. Its worldwide opening reached approximately $47 million for an $85 million production. That is not a disastrous opening, but it is also not a massive blockbuster opening. The movie needs a long theatrical run and strong international performance to become a major financial success. And this is where it is important not to pretend that we already know the final box office story. We do not. The film has only just entered theaters. Its final worldwide total could be much higher. It could also slow down quickly. The first weekend only tells part of the story. Word of mouth will matter, audience reactions will matter. International markets will matter, and the movie's eventual streaming performance could become important too. That uncertainty is actually part of what makes covering a new movie exciting. We are watching the story develop in real time. The critical response has been stronger than the opening weekend might suggest, and that creates a potentially interesting situation for The End of Oak Street. It may not become the biggest blockbuster of 2026, but it could become one of those movies that audience remember. Sometimes those are not the same thing. A movie can make hundreds of millions and disappear from the cultural conversation a year later. Another movie can have a modest theatrical run and slowly become a cult favorite. The End of Oak Street has some of the ingredients for the second category. It is original, it has a strange premise, it has recognizable stars. It has a filmmaker with a distinctive style, it has dinosaurs, it has emotional family drama, it has a memorable visual identity, and it has a controversial ending. That is a pretty good recipe for internet discussion. The movie has already produced jokes and memes because of the basic concept alone. The easiest joke is obvious. Imagine buying a house in a quiet neighborhood and then the entire neighborhood gets transported to the Jurassic period. Another joke practically writes itself. Your HOA complaining about your lawn suddenly seems less important when a dinosaur is eating the neighbor. And then there is the classic suburban nightmare. You think the strange noise outside is a burglar. You look through the window, it is a dinosaur. At that point. You probably stop worrying about your security system. One of the funniest ideas behind the movie is that all of the normal suburban problems suddenly become completely meaningless. A broken fence? Who cares? A noisy neighbor? Who cares? A parking argument? Forget it. You have a prehistoric predator walking down the street. The movie's premise makes everyday problems look almost comically small. But beneath those jokes is something surprisingly emotional. The film asks what happens when all the things we think are important disappear. What would you protect if you lost everything? Your house, your possessions, your career, or your family? Denise eventually realizes the answer, and that is the emotional center of the movie. The title may promise destruction, the movie ultimately delivers connection. That is why the final scenes are so important. The film begins with a family that is emotionally divided, it ends with the possibility of rebuilding. The strange cosmic event becomes a metaphor for a family being forced to stop and look at itself. And that may be the smartest part of David Robert Mitchell's screenplay. The high concept gives him a reason to explore a simple human question. If you knew you were going to lose someone tomorrow, what would you say to them today? That question is much more powerful than any dinosaur, and it is why the movie can work even for people who are not huge fans of creature features. The dinosaurs bring people into the theater, the family keeps them emotionally invested. The mystery keeps them curious, and the ending gives them something to discuss afterward. That is a very old fashioned movie formula, and perhaps that is exactly the point. The End of Oak Street feels like a movie that remembers when summer blockbusters were allowed to be weird, before every major release had to be part of a giant franchise, before audiences expected 10 post credit scenes. Before every mysterious trailer was assumed to be setting up a cinematic universe, this movie simply says, what if your street got moved to the dinosaur age? and then it tried to make that idea entertaining. There is something refreshing about that. Of course, the film is not perfect. Some viewers will find the screenplay too simple, some will question the logic of the time travel rules, others may feel that the emotional material becomes too sentimental. The 1980s setting may also divide audiences. For some people, it adds charm. For others, it feels like another example of Hollywood's continuing obsession with nostalgia. That criticism has already appeared in reviews, with some viewers arguing that the story could have worked just as well in the present day. And that is a fair argument. Modern technology could have created an entirely different story. Imagine the characters trying to use smartphones after being transported into prehistory. Imagine the internet disappearing. Imagine people live streaming dinosaurs until their batteries die. Imagine social media becoming useless. That could have been interesting, but the 1980s setting gives the movie something else. It removes modern technology and creates a more timeless adventure. It also connects the film to the era of classic family science fiction movies. And there is one more reason the 1980s setting matters. It makes the neighborhood feel like a memory. A perfect little suburban world, a place that seems frozen in time, and then that world is literally thrown into another time. That is almost poetic. The movie is about time travel, but it is also about memory. It asks what happens when the world you remember no longer exists. That idea becomes even more meaningful when considering the film's dedication. The movie includes a dedication to Hudson Joseph Meek, the young actor who died in 2024 at the age of 16 and appears in the film as Caden Tucker. His appearance in the end of Oak Street became his final on screen performance. The movie also includes a dedication connected to Eric Tremont Miller, while Mitchell dedicated the project to his late father. That gives the movie's themes of memory, loss, and family an unexpectedly personal dimension. Hudson Meek's presence in the film is not simply a piece of trivia. For people who knew his work, watching the movie becomes a bittersweet experience. A young actor who had already appeared in projects such as Baby Driver and The School Duel completed this performance before his death, and now audiences are seeing his final film appearance years later. That is one of those facts that changes how a viewer looks at a movie. Suddenly, a scene that might have seemed like a normal supporting moment carries another layer of emotion. The film cannot escape real life. No matter how fantastical the story becomes, the people who made it are real, the actors are real, the losses surrounding the production are real, and that is why movies can sometimes become more meaningful long after the cameras stop rolling. When you step back and look at everything surrounding the end of Oak Street, the movie becomes surprisingly easy to understand. It is a story about a family. It is wrapped inside a dinosaur adventure. That adventure is wrapped inside a time travel mystery, and all of it is presented through the visual language of a nostalgic 1980s suburban movie. That is a lot of layers for a movie that can be summarized in one sentence. Your neighborhood gets transported to the age of dinosaurs. But the simplicity of the premise is actually one of its biggest advantages. You do not need a PhD in science fiction lore to understand it. You do not need to watch six previous movies. You do not need to know a superhero's entire history. You simply need to care whether this family survives. And that is exactly what the filmmakers wanted. The movie may have been marketed around dinosaurs, but its biggest weapon is not a dinosaur. It is Anne Hathaway's emotional performance. Its biggest surprise is not necessarily a creature reveal, it is the decision to change Greg's fate. Its biggest mystery is not which dinosaur will appear next. It is whether this family can become a family again. And perhaps its biggest achievement is that it takes a completely absurd premise and makes it feel emotionally believable. That is harder than it looks because anybody can make a dinosaur movie. The real challenge is making the audience care about the people standing in front of the dinosaur. And the end of Oak Street understands that. That is why, despite its strange premise, the film feels surprisingly human. It is about fear. It is about regret. It is about parents trying to protect their children. It is about two people realizing that they may have taken each other for granted. It is about what happens when the future suddenly disappears. And most importantly, it is about getting another chance. That is the part I think audiences may remember long after they forget which dinosaur appeared in which scene. Because beneath all the prehistoric chaos, the end of Oak Street is really asking a simple question. If everything around you disappeared tomorrow, Who would you want standing beside you? And when the movie finally answers that question, the dinosaurs suddenly feel like the background. The family was the story all along. And that is what makes The End of Oak Street one of the more surprising theatrical movies of 2026. Not because it has the biggest budget, not because it has the biggest opening, not because it belongs to a famous franchise, but because somebody looked at an ordinary suburban street and asked the most ridiculous question imaginable. What if we moved the whole thing to the age of dinosaurs? And instead of laughing and walking away, David Robert Mitchell actually made the movie, and somehow, against all odds, it works. The most interesting thing about The End of Oak Street may actually be the fact that the movie existed for years before most people even knew what it was. David Robert Mitchell had been away from filmmaking for a surprisingly long time. His previous feature, Under the Silver Lake, arrived in 2018, and after that, there was a long period where audiences had no idea what his next movie would be. Then Warner Bros. Announced an untitled project from Mitchell, produced with J.J. Abrams and Bad Robot, and suddenly people started paying attention. The strange thing was that almost nobody knew the story. The project was kept unusually quiet, and that secrecy became part of its identity. When Anne Hathaway joined the movie, the project immediately became more interesting. Hathaway was already one of the most recognizable actresses in Hollywood, but this was not an obvious role for her. She had done dramas, musicals, action movies, comedies, superhero films, and huge fantasy productions. Yet a strange 1980s dinosaur survival movie from the director of It Follows was something completely different. That contrast was probably one of the reasons the casting worked so well. You had an Oscar winning actress entering a movie that on paper sounded completely crazy, and then there was the question of who would play her husband. Oscar Isaac was originally in talks to appear opposite Hathaway. For a while, that seemed like the likely pairing. Isaac and Hathaway would have brought a very different energy to the story. But Isaac ultimately did not join the movie, and Ewan McGregor stepped into the role of Greg Platt. Macy Stella and Christian Convery were also brought in as the Platt children, completing the central family. Later, Jordan Alexa Davis, PJ Byrne, and Chris Coy joined the supporting cast. The Oscar Isaac story is one of those pieces of movie trivia that becomes especially interesting because the final cast feels so natural. Once you see McGregor and Hathaway together, it is difficult to imagine the movie any other way. McGregor has a particular ability to make a character feel vulnerable without making him weak. Greg is not presented as a perfect husband or some unstoppable action hero. He is a man who is already dealing with problems at home when the universe suddenly decides to make his life infinitely worse. That is where the casting becomes more important than it initially appears. If the actors had treated the movie like a joke, the whole thing could have collapsed. Imagine Anne Hathaway screaming at a dinosaur while Ewan McGregor delivers sarcastic one liners every 30 seconds. It could have turned into a completely different movie. Instead, the performances mostly treat the situation seriously. The characters are frightened because, from their perspective, this is not an adventure. This is the end of everything they understand. David Robert Mitchell has talked about the original idea behind the movie, and one of the most fascinating parts of its development is how simple the inspiration was. The idea came from imagining a dinosaur in an ordinary suburban environment. That sounds like such a small thought, but it contains the entire movie inside it. What would happen if something prehistoric suddenly appeared in a place designed for modern human life? What would that look like? What would people do? How would the environment change the meaning of something as ordinary as a house or a street? That simple thought eventually became an entire screenplay, and this is where Mitchell's earlier movies become important. If you only know the end of Oak Street as a dinosaur movie, you might expect something similar to Jurassic Park or Jurassic World. But Mitchell's filmmaking background suggests something different. His movies often focus on atmosphere, paranoia, and the feeling that something is wrong before the characters fully understand what is happening. It Follows is the clearest example. The horror comes from the idea that danger can be approaching slowly and constantly. The characters have to live with that fear. That same philosophy can be seen in the end of Oak Street. Mitchell does not need to show a dinosaur immediately. He can make the audience wait. He can show something strange happening in the environment. He can allow the characters to stare at something they cannot understand. The tension comes from uncertainty. This is also why the movie feels closer to old science fiction and supernatural television than a standard modern dinosaur blockbuster. Mitchell has cited influences including The Twilight Zone, Poltergeist, and Signs, and that influence can be felt in the way ordinary suburban life becomes strange. There is something very powerful about taking an ordinary street and making it frightening. Horror filmmakers have used this idea for decades. A haunted house is frightening because a house is supposed to be safe. A monster in a forest is frightening because the forest is supposed to be unknown. But a dinosaur standing in the middle of a suburban neighborhood creates a different kind of fear because the audience recognizes the environment. You know what a driveway looks like, you know what a garage looks like, you know what it feels like to walk down a quiet residential street. So, when a massive prehistoric creature enters that environment, the scale becomes disturbing. The movie understands this very well. One of the biggest production challenges was therefore not simply creating dinosaurs. It was creating dinosaurs that felt like they belonged in the same physical world as the characters. Production designer Maya Shimoguchi and cinematographer Michael Gulakis had to create a visual language where the ordinary and the prehistoric could exist together. The official production credits also list John Axelrad as editor, Aaron Benak as costume designer, and Michael Giacchino as composer. Michael Giolakis was another particularly appropriate choice. He had already worked with Mitchell on It Follows and Under the Silver Lake, so the director was working with a cinematographer who understood his visual instincts. That continuity matters. The movie does not feel like a generic studio project where a director's personality has been removed. There is a very deliberate look to the film: the colors, the lighting, the wide shots, the quiet suburban spaces, the way the camera watches the characters, the way darkness is used. All of these elements help create the feeling that something impossible has entered an otherwise ordinary world. And then the movie makes an important choice. It does not immediately explain everything. The audience knows that something has happened, but the characters are also trying to understand it. This makes the film more mysterious during its early stages. That mystery was also important during the marketing campaign. For a long time, the movie was known as Flower Vale Street. That title appeared during production and it became the name fans used when discussing the project. The title itself caused some people to wonder whether the movie had any connection to Cloverfield. The combination of a mysterious event, J.J. Abrams as producer, and a title ending in Street was enough to create online speculation. But the movie is not a Cloverfield film. J.J. Abrams produced it, but that does not make it part of the Cloverfield universe. Anne Hathaway and Abrams have also discussed the project in that context, and the movie ultimately stands on its own. This is another example of how modern audiences have become trained to look for connections. If a movie has a mysterious title, people assume a franchise. If J.J. Abrams is involved, people expect a mystery box. If there is a strange creature, people immediately start asking whether it is connected to something else. But The End of Oak Street does not need another franchise to justify itself. In fact, one of its most refreshing qualities is that it is an original story. There is no established superhero. There is no previous movie. There is no comic book mythology. There is no decade of continuity. There is simply a family, a neighborhood, and an impossible event. That is becoming increasingly unusual for a large Hollywood science fiction movie. The production itself began in 2024. Principal photography started on March 22nd and continued through June 4, with filming taking place in London and Atlanta. That timing is interesting because the movie did not reach theaters until 2026. So, audiences were waiting for more than 2 years after filming had wrapped. During that time, almost nothing substantial was revealed. The project remained mysterious, and then the release schedule changed. The movie was originally scheduled for May 16, 2025. Later, it was moved to March 13, 2026. Finally, it settled on August 14, 2026 in North America. Those delays naturally created more speculation. Whenever a movie moves dates, people start wondering whether something is wrong. Maybe the visual effects need more time. Maybe the studio does not believe in it. Maybe reshoots change the movie. Maybe the story is complicated. Maybe the studio is trying to find a better release window. In this case, the long wait turned out to be less mysterious than people imagined. The movie eventually arrived with a strong marketing campaign built around its central concept. And once the first trailer showed dinosaurs, the entire conversation changed. Suddenly, everybody knew what the movie was, and the reaction was basically, wait, this is a dinosaur movie? That surprise was one of the best things the marketing had going for it. The movie's first teaser had the responsibility of selling something that sounded completely ridiculous without making it look ridiculous. That is a difficult balance. If the trailer had shown too much comedy, audiences might have assumed it was a parody. If it had shown only serious family drama, people would not have understood the dinosaur element. If it had shown too many dinosaurs, it would have spoiled the surprises. So the marketing focused heavily on the mystery and the family. The basic message was simple. Something has happened to Oak Street, the family is trapped, something is hunting them, and they need to figure out how to get home. That was enough. The dinosaurs were the secret weapon. The official synopsis describes a mysterious cosmic event that rips Oak Street from suburbia and transports the neighborhood somewhere unknown, leaving the Platt family dependent on one another for survival. The phrase somewhere unknown is important because the movie is not only about dinosaurs, it is also about discovery. The characters have to understand where they are. They have to understand what happened, they have to understand whether they can return, and eventually they have to understand what they are willing to sacrifice. That gives the film several different layers. At the surface, it is a creature survival movie, underneath, it is a family drama. Underneath that, it is a story about time. And underneath everything is the idea of second chances. The family already has problems before the cosmic event. Denise and Greg are not in a perfect marriage. Their relationship is strained. There is emotional distance. They are approaching a breaking point. Then the universe literally breaks their world apart. That is an almost perfect metaphor. Their family is already falling apart emotionally, and then their neighborhood is physically torn apart by the cosmic event. The external disaster mirrors the internal disaster. The street disappears, the normal world disappears, and the characters are forced to confront each other. That is one of the reasons the movie feels more mature than its premise suggests. If the story were simply about dinosaurs attacking people, there would not be much to discuss. But when the dinosaurs become a test for the family, every attack has emotional consequences, every separation matters, every reunion matters, every decision matters, and that is where Maisie Stella and Christian Convery become important. They are not simply there to give the adults someone to protect. Audrey and Brian have their own reactions to the disaster. They are frightened, they are confused. They also have to process the fact that their parents are struggling with each other at exactly the moment when the family needs to stay together. That is a very real family dynamic. Children often notice more than adults think. They can feel when their parents are unhappy. They can sense tension. They may not understand every detail, but they know when something is wrong. So, the dinosaur situation does not erase the family's existing problems. It makes them impossible to ignore, and that is what makes the movie's emotional structure work. The characters cannot simply escape the dinosaurs, they also have to escape the version of themselves brought them to the brink of separation. That is why the movie's ending has become such a major talking point. And if you are watching this as a review before seeing the film, this is where the major spoilers begin. Greg's apparent death is one of the biggest emotional moments in the entire movie. He faces an Allosaurus in an attempt to protect Denise. It is not presented as a casual action sequence. The scene is frightening because Greg knows exactly what he is doing. He is putting himself between the creature and his family. And when it appears that he has died, the movie suddenly becomes much darker. The audience is forced to confront the possibility that this family has survived the dinosaurs but lost its father. And then comes the twist. Greg's death was not always intended to be permanent. According to Ewan McGregor and Anne Hathaway, the ending was changed relatively early in production so that Greg could return. McGregor described the filming of the dinosaur confrontation as physically demanding, while Hathaway explained that she initially had reservations about changing the original ending. This is one of those behind the scenes decisions that completely changes the way you watch the movie. Imagine the original ending, Greg dies. Denise survives, the children survive, they return home. But the family is permanently broken. That would have been a much more tragic ending. Instead, the filmmakers chose hope. They decided that the movie should give the audience emotional relief after everything the characters had suffered. And there is a very specific reason that works. The movie is ultimately about second chances. If Greg remained dead, the film would be saying that some mistakes cannot be repaired. The final version says something different. Sometimes you are given another opportunity. Sometimes the universe gives you a chance to go back. And sometimes the most important thing is recognizing what you almost lost. The ending therefore works on two levels. On the science fiction level, the characters manipulate the timeline. On the emotional level, they are given a chance to reset their family. That is why the barbecue ending matters. It is not simply a happy ending, it is a symbol. The family is together, the ordinary world has returned, and something that seemed impossible has been undone. The movie essentially destroys the family and then rebuilds it. That is a classic storytelling structure, but the dinosaur setting makes it feel completely different. And there is another interesting detail in the final scenes. The movie does not treat the ending as a giant victory parade. It becomes quieter. The chaos disappears. The characters get a moment to breathe. That contrast is important. After spending so much time surrounded by prehistoric danger, the ordinary suburban environment suddenly feels beautiful. A backyard, a table, a meal, a family together. Things that seem boring at the beginning now feel precious. That is one of the movie's central ideas. We often appreciate ordinary life only after we lose it. At the beginning, Oak Street is just Oak Street. By the end, it represents home, and that makes it a title more emotional. The end of Oak Street can mean the end of the neighborhood as the characters knew it, but it can also mean the end of one chapter of their lives. The old family is gone, a new family begins, and perhaps that is the real ending. Not the return from prehistoric Earth, the return to each other. That is also why Anne Hathaway's performance is so important. She has to make the audience believe that Denise is not simply afraid of dinosaurs, she is afraid of losing her family. Those are two completely different kinds of fear. A dinosaur can kill you, but losing the person you love can change your entire life. Hathaway brings that emotional difference to the role. She can scream, she can run, she can fight, but some of her strongest moments are quieter. The moments where Denise realizes something has gone terribly wrong, the moments where she watches Greg. The moments where she looks at her children, the moments where she realizes that the family she thought was falling apart may be the one thing she cannot live without. That is where Hathaway's performance becomes more than genre acting. She makes the fantasy feel human. Ewan McGregor does something similar. Greg is not perfect. That is important. If he were perfect, his sacrifice would be less interesting. Instead, he is a flawed husband who gets a chance to prove what he really cares about. His heroism does not erase his mistakes, but it gives Denise and the audience a new way to understand him. That is a much more interesting character arc than simply turning him into a superhero. And then there is the dinosaur itself. The Allosaurus becomes almost like a force of nature. It does not hate Greg, it does not know who he is. It is not a villain with a plan, it is an animal. That makes the scene more frightening. The dinosaur is simply doing what a predator does, and the humans are the ones who have entered its world. This is an important difference between the end of Oak Street and many traditional monster movies. The dinosaurs are not evil, they are not villains. They are not attacking because they have a grudge against humanity. They are simply living in a world where the humans do not belong. The neighborhood has become the invasive species. That idea gives the movie an ecological dimension. Imagine suddenly dropping a modern suburban street into prehistoric Earth. The people would not understand the environment, the animals would not understand the people, everything would be out of balance. The characters are not simply fighting dinosaurs, they are fighting an environment that was never designed for them. That is why survival becomes so difficult. They have no food system, no reliable transportation, no modern infrastructure, no familiar roads, no emergency services. They are completely isolated. And isolation is one of David Robert Mitchell's favorite tools. That is where his horror background really shows. He understands that fear becomes stronger when help is unavailable. If you know the police are 5 minutes away, a strange noise is less frightening. If you know nobody is coming, every sound becomes terrifying. That is the psychology behind the movie. The characters cannot call for help. They cannot simply drive to a hospital. They cannot walk to the nearest town. They are alone and the audience knows it. That creates tension even when no dinosaur is visible. This is why some of the movie's best scenes are not necessarily the biggest ones. A quiet shot of neighborhood can be more effective than an explosion. A distant sound can be more frightening than a creature running directly toward the camera. A character looking into the darkness can create more suspense than an expensive visual effects sequence. That restraint is one of Mitchell's strengths. It also explains why some viewers compare the film to classic Amblin cinema while others criticize it for borrowing too heavily from those movies. That disagreement is important. The movie clearly wants to evoke the feeling of older Spielberg era adventure films. Critics have praised that quality, describing the film as an Amblin style summer adventure and a throwback to the kind of blockbuster that could have been designed for a drive in theater. But other critics have been much harsher. Some have argued that the movie borrows too heavily from films such as E.T., Poltergeist, Jurassic Park, and Super 8, to the point where the nostalgia becomes imitation rather than inspiration, and honestly, both arguments make sense. You can enjoy the references and still admit that they are obvious. The movie wears its influences openly. It is not trying to pretend that it invented suburban science fiction, it is trying to bring that style back. The question is whether you think that is charming or unoriginal. For me, the answer depends on what you want from the movie. If you want a completely original science fiction concept that has never existed before, this movie will probably disappoint you. But if you want a big screen adventure that feels different, were different from another superhero sequel, another remake, or another franchise chapter, then the end of Oak Street becomes much more appealing. Because even if its influences are obvious, its combination is unusual: a suburban family drama, a dinosaur survival movie, a time travel story, a cosmic mystery, a 1980s period piece, a marriage story, and a film about second chances. That is a strange mixture, and sometimes strange mixtures are exactly what cinema needs. The movie's box office is another interesting part of the story. It opened domestically to roughly $21 million and reached about $47 million worldwide in its opening frame, according to early reports. Those numbers are not enormous for an $85 million movie, but they are also not a disaster. The movie has a path forward. If audiences continue recommending it, the theatrical run could become much stronger. The critical reception gives it an advantage. An 85% plus critic score gives the movie credibility. A roughly 70% audience score suggests that viewers are more divided. That difference could become important over the coming weeks. The movie does not need everyone to love it. It simply needs enough people to say, you should see this in a theater. That kind of word of mouth can keep an original movie alive, and this is exactly why The End of Oak Street could become a cult favorite even if it does not become a gigantic blockbuster. People love strange movies. People love movies that are easy to explain to their friends, and this movie has one of the easiest pitches imaginable. Imagine your whole neighborhood gets sent back to the dinosaur age. You can say that in 5 seconds, and people immediately understand why they might want to watch it. That is powerful. It is also extremely meme friendly. The movie practically creates its own jokes. The suburban family trying to survive dinosaurs is already funny. The idea of an entire neighborhood disappearing is funny. The idea of someone worrying about normal suburban problems while dinosaurs are outside is funny. And the title itself has become part of the joke. The End of Oak Street. Not the end of the world, not the extinction of humanity, just the end of Oak Street, as if the dinosaurs specifically decided that this particular neighborhood had to go. That understated title makes the enormous premise even funnier. But underneath the memes is a serious movie, and that contrast is probably what makes it work. You can laugh at the concept. Then suddenly the movie asks us to care about a family. You can laugh at the dinosaurs. Then suddenly someone is in danger. You can enjoy the nostalgia. Then suddenly the movie becomes about grief. That tonal movement is risky, but it is also what gives the movie personality. Michael Giacchino's music plays a major role in keeping those tones connected. His score allows the film to move between adventure, suspense, wonder, and emotion without feeling like four completely different movies. The production team officially lists Giacchino as the composer, with Julakis handling cinematography and Axelrad handling editing. Giacchino is almost perfectly suited to this kind of project. He knows how to write music that sounds nostalgic without becoming completely old fashioned. He knows how to make an orchestra sound enormous. And he understands emotional themes that matters because the end of Oak Street needs music that can make a dinosaur feel enormous 1 minute and make a family reunion feel heartbreaking the next. The score essentially becomes another character. It tells the audience how to feel when the characters themselves cannot explain what they are experiencing. And that is one of the reasons the movie feels bigger than its basic premise. There is a craft behind it, a lot of craft, production design, cinematography, editing, music performances, visual effects, sound design. All of these elements have to work together to make the impossible believable, and when they do, the audience stops thinking about how ridiculous the premise is. You stop asking how a neighborhood could possibly travel through time. You stop asking why dinosaurs are there. You simply start wondering, are they going to make it home? That is the moment when the movie succeeds, because cinema does not always need perfect logic, it needs emotional logic. And the end of Oak Street understands that the character's emotions make sense even when the science does not. Denise's fear makes sense, Greg's sacrifice makes sense, the children's panic makes sense, the desire to return home makes sense, the desire to save the family makes sense. And once those emotions become believable, the audience is willing to accept the fantasy. That is probably the biggest lesson of the movie. You do not need to explain every impossible thing. You need to make the audience care about the people experiencing it. And by the time the final act arrives, that is exactly what has happened. The dinosaurs have become secondary, the cosmic event has become secondary, even the mystery has become secondary. The family is what matters. That is why the ending lands emotionally for some viewers. And it is also why other viewers may find it too sentimental. The movie is not ashamed of its heart, it wants you to feel something. It wants the audience to leave the theater thinking about family. It wants the final reunion to matter. It wants the ordinary backyard to feel like a miracle. And in an era when many big movies are afraid of being sincere, there is something refreshing about that. Maybe the end of Oak Street is not the most original movie of 2026. Maybe it borrows too much from the films that inspired it. Maybe the science fiction explanation is not perfect. Maybe the ending is too convenient, maybe the movie could have been even darker, but it has something that many technically impressive blockbusters lack. It has a heart, and that heart belongs to the Platt family. The dinosaurs may sell the ticket. The mystery may sell the trailer, Anne Hathaway and Ewan McGregor may sell the poster, but the family is what makes the movie memorable. And when the credits begin, the most important question is not whether the dinosaurs looked realistic. It is whether you cared when Greg disappeared, whether you cared when Denise was trying to protect her children, whether you cared when the family finally had a chance to go home. If the answer is yes, then the movie has done its job. Because underneath all the dinosaurs, time portals, cosmic events, and subvert chaos, the end of Oak Street is a very simple story. A family is falling apart, the world ends, and somehow that gives them one last chance to find each other again. And that may be the strangest thing about this movie. The story begins with the end of the world, but emotionally, it is really about a new beginning. There is one more layer to the end of Oak Street that becomes much more interesting when you stop looking at it as a simple dinosaur movie and start looking at it as a story about the fear of losing your home. At the beginning, Oak Street is almost boring on purpose. It is the kind of place most people would barely notice. Houses sit next to each other, cars move along the road, children have their normal routines, parents worry about their normal problems, and everyone assumes tomorrow will look almost exactly like today. That is what makes the transformation so powerful. The movie does not begin in a spectacular fantasy world, it begins somewhere familiar because the filmmakers want the audience to understand what is being taken away. When the cosmic event happens, the characters are not simply losing a location, they are losing their sense of normality. They wake up in a world where the rules they trusted no longer exist. The road does not lead where it should. The landscape is no longer recognizable. The sounds outside are different. Even the sky seems to belong to another world. Suddenly, the place that was supposed to be their safe home becomes a prison surrounded by danger. That idea gives the film a surprisingly emotional foundation because almost everyone understands the feeling of having a place that represents safety. Home is not just walls and furniture, it is memory, it is routine, it is the feeling that you know what is going to happen next. The Platt family loses that feeling almost instantly. This is also why the film's suburban setting is so important. If the same story happened to a group of professional soldiers, the audience would expect them to know how to survive. If it happened to scientists, we would expect them to understand the strange environment. If it happened to an expedition team, we would expect them to have equipment and supplies. But the Platts are ordinary people. They are parents and children who were living a normal life. They did not prepare for dinosaurs. They did not pack survival equipment. They did not study prehistoric biology. They did not expect to become explorers. Their greatest advantage is simply that they have each other. That creates a very different kind of survival story. Every decision feels dangerous because there is no expert in the family who can confidently say what to do next. They have to learn as they go, they have to make mistakes, they have to depend on instinct. And that makes their fear easier to understand. The movie also uses this idea to make the children important rather than treating them as background characters. Audrey and Brian are not simply there so the adults have something to protect. They are experiencing the disaster from their own perspective. Imagine being a child and suddenly discovering that your entire neighborhood has been transported into a prehistoric world. You do not understand the science, you do not understand the cosmic event. You only know that your parents are scared and that strange creatures are outside. For a child, that'd be almost impossible to process. The movie understands that fear. The children are frightened, but they also have moments of curiosity. That combination feels realistic because children can be terrified of something while still wanting to understand it. They may hide from a dinosaur and then immediately want to know what kind of dinosaur it was. They may ask questions at exactly the wrong time. They may make decisions that adults consider dangerous, but they are also capable of surprising courage. Christian Convery brings a youthful energy to Brian, while Macy Steller gives Audrey a more emotionally complicated presence. Their performances help keep the movie from becoming completely centered on the adults. That matters because the film is ultimately about a family, not just a married couple. The children are part of the emotional reason Denise and Greg have to keep fighting. Every argument between the parents carries more weight because their children are watching. Every decision becomes a question of what kind of family they want to be after the disaster is over. This gives the story another level of tension. The dinosaurs are trying to destroy the family physically, while the family's own problems threaten to destroy it emotionally. That contrast is one of the smartest parts of the screenplay. The film essentially creates two threats at the same time. One threat is outside the house. The other threat is inside the family. The dinosaurs are obvious, the relationship problems are quieter, but both threats can cause damage. Denise and Greg cannot simply defeat their marriage problems with a weapon. They have to talk, understand each other, and make choices. The prehistoric world forces them to confront things they might have avoided in normal life. That is a common theme in disaster movies, but it works here because the family was already under pressure before the world changed. David Robert Mitchell's writing also benefits from his willingness to let the characters exist as imperfect people. This is important because many big budget adventure movies have a tendency to make their heroes instantly likable. They are funny, brave, intelligent, and morally clear from the beginning. The plots are messier. Greg makes mistakes. Denise has frustrations, their relationship contains unresolved issues, they are not always patient with each other, they sometimes say the wrong thing. But when the crisis comes, those imperfections make their eventual sacrifices feel more meaningful. The movie is not about perfect people becoming heroes. It is about ordinary people discovering what they are capable of when everything familiar disappears. The visual storytelling reinforces this. Michael Joulakis' cinematography often places the characters inside large environments, making them look small against the prehistoric world. That is an important visual choice. In a normal suburban movie, a house can feel large and protective. In the prehistoric world, the same house suddenly feels tiny. A driveway becomes a path surrounded by wilderness. A backyard becomes an exposed area where a predator could appear at any moment. The camera can show a family standing beside something enormous and remind the audience that humans are no longer at the top of the food chain. That idea is one of the most effective elements of the dinosaur sequences. The movie does not need every creature to be gigantic. Sometimes a medium sized predator can be more frightening because it feels fast and unpredictable. Other times, the film uses enormous creatures simply to remind the audience how small the neighborhood has become. There is something almost surreal about seeing an animal that belongs millions of years in the past moving through a place designed for suburban life. A dinosaur crossing a street is inherently strange. A dinosaur looking through a window is even stranger. The movie understands that the contrast itself is a visual effect, and this is where the practical and digital filmmaking techniques become important. A creature like an Allosaurus has to interact with real objects. Its feet need to appear grounded. Its body needs to react naturally to the environment. Its movement has to match the lighting. Its shadow has to fall correctly. The characters need to look in the right direction. Their reactions need to happen at the right time. If any of these elements are wrong, the audience immediately sees the illusion. Modern viewers have seen thousands of visual effects shots, so they are extremely sensitive to creatures that look artificial. The production team therefore had to create a world where the dinosaurs could feel physical. The film's $85 million production budget is not enormous by modern blockbuster standards, but it is large enough to support significant visual effects while still requiring the filmmakers to be careful about where they spend the money. Instead of destroying an entire city in every scene, the movie can focus on smaller environments where the creature effects matter more. A dinosaur appearing between houses can be more effective than a giant destruction sequence because the audience understands the scale. That restraint is another reason the movie feels different from a typical franchise blockbuster. There is no need for the entire planet to explode. The stakes are personal. If Dennis loses Greg, that matters. If the children become separated from their parents, that matters. If the family loses its home, that matters. The movie does not need 100,000 people running through a city to communicate danger. Four people are enough. This is where the film's title becomes almost ironic. The end of Oak Street sounds like something small. It does not sound like the end of civilization. It sounds like the closure of a local road. But for the Platt family, Oak Street is their entire world, so the title is actually personal rather than global. The end of Oak Street is the end of their old life. The cosmic event itself can also be interpreted in several ways. On the surface, it is science fiction. Something happens that causes the neighborhood to be displaced through time or reality. The movie gives the audience enough information to understand what happened, but it does not spend the entire runtime trying to become a physics textbook. That is probably a wise decision. If the film spent 30 minutes explaining the mechanics of the event, it would destroy much of its mystery. Instead, the audience is encouraged to accept the strange situation and focus on what the characters do with it. This is one area where viewers may disagree. Some people enjoy mystery because it allows imagination. Other people want every rule explained. If you are the second kind of viewer, there are moments in the end of Oak Street where you may feel that the science is convenient, but that is not necessarily a flaw if you approach the movie as a character driven adventure. The cosmic event is a storytelling device. Its job is to place the family in an impossible situation. The emotional consequences are more important than a detailed scientific explanation. The movie also plays with the idea of time in a clever emotional way. The characters are physically transported into another era, but they are also emotionally stuck in their own past. Denise and Greg carry their old arguments with them. Their relationship problems do not disappear simply because the world changes. In that sense, the family has to travel through time emotionally as well as physically. They have to move beyond the problems that existed before the disaster. They have to become different people if they want their family to survive. That makes Greg's apparent death especially meaningful. His sacrifice becomes a moment where the old Greg disappears. The man who may have failed to appreciate his family becomes the man willing to put himself between his wife and a dinosaur. It is not that one heroic act magically erases every mistake he ever made. Rather, it shows Denise and the audience what he is capable of when the stakes become absolute. And when the movie ultimately gives him another chance, it is almost as if the story is saying that people should not wait for a catastrophe before realizing what matters. This is also why the ending change behind the scenes is worth discussing. Originally, the filmmakers were prepared to let Greg remain dead. That would have made the movie much darker. Anne Hathaway reportedly had doubts about changing the ending because the original version had a certain emotional power. But the filmmakers eventually decided that the story should end on hope. Ewan McGregor and Hathaway have spoken about the decision and the filming of the sequence, giving fans an interesting glimpse into how the ending evolved. That is one of the most fascinating behind the scenes facts because audiences rarely get to see how a single ending can change the entire emotional meaning of a movie. A permanent death would tell us that survival has a price and that the family can never return to what it was. The final version tells us something more optimistic. The characters have suffered, but they can still have a future together. Some viewers will prefer the darker version, and honestly, I can understand why. A tragic ending could have stayed with the audience longer. It could have made the movie feel more haunting. Imagine the family returning home without Greg and realizing that the world they wanted to recover is permanently changed. That would have been heartbreaking, but the final ending fits the movie's warmer personality. The film is not trying to destroy the audience, it is trying to give them an adventure. And after spending so much time watching the family suffer, the emotional release of the final scenes becomes important. This also connects to the movie's Amblin influence. Classic family adventure films often allow characters to experience danger without ending in complete despair. There is fear, sadness, and loss, but there is usually a sense that something has been learned. The characters come out changed, home becomes more meaningful, family becomes more important. Childhood or adulthood has moved into a new stage. The end of Oak Street clearly understands that tradition. That does not mean every viewer will love the nostalgia. Some people have already criticized the film for leaning too heavily into familiar 1980s science fiction imagery. The movie intentionally recalls films such as E.T., Poltergeist, Jurassic Park, The Goonies, and Super 8. For some viewers, that is part of the charm. For others, it can feel like Hollywood looking backward instead of creating something completely new. But nostalgia is not automatically a weakness. The real question is whether the filmmaker has something personal to say through those influences. Mitchell does. He has always been interested in ordinary spaces becoming strange. That idea connects his earlier work to this film. It follows takes familiar American neighborhoods and makes them threatening. Under the Silver Lake turns Los Angeles into a giant puzzle. The end of Oak Street takes a suburban neighborhood and turns it into prehistoric wilderness. The settings change, the feeling remains something ordinary is hiding something extraordinary. That is very much a David Robert Mitchell idea. And that makes the movie feel more personal than a simple studio assignment. It may have a big budget and major stars, but it still carries the personality of its director. That personality can also be seen in the pacing. The film does not rush through every scene. It allows moments of uncertainty. Sometimes the characters simply look around and try to understand where they are. This may frustrate viewers who want constant action, but it is essential to the atmosphere. If dinosaurs attacked every 5 minutes, they would stop being frightening. The first dinosaur is shocking, the second is exciting, the fifth becomes normal. The movie therefore has to protect the creatures by using them carefully. That is a classic horror technique. The less you see, the more your imagination works, and when the creatures finally appear, the visual payoff becomes stronger. Sound design also plays a major role. Before the audience sees a dinosaur, they may hear one. A distant roar can travel through the trees, branches can move, birds can suddenly scatter. The characters can hear something approaching without knowing what it is. These details make the prehistoric environment feel alive. That is another important difference between this movie and a simple monster spectacle. The prehistoric world is not empty, it is an ecosystem. There are sounds everywhere, animals are moving, something is always happening beyond the frame. The family is entering a world that was already alive long before they arrived. This creates an interesting philosophical idea. The plants think they have been transported into a dangerous world, but from the perspective of the dinosaurs, the humans are the strange creatures. The dinosaurs are not invading Earth, the humans are invading the dinosaurs' world. That reversal gives the film an ecological feeling, even if it does not become an environmental message movie. The family is essentially an accident. They do not belong there. Every one modern object becomes strange in the prehistoric environment. A car is useless, a suburban house becomes fragile, electricity becomes uncertain, food becomes a problem. Clean water becomes important. Modern civilization suddenly looks much less powerful than it did the day before. That is a humbling idea. We like to believe that humans control the world because we have technology, buildings, and machines. Take those things away, and we are still animals trying to survive. The movie uses dinosaurs to remind us of that, and perhaps this is why the film's action scenes feel more intense than expected. The characters cannot simply overpower the environment. They have to escape it, they have to hide, they have to think, they have to work together. The family becomes stronger because they have no other choice. That is also true of Denise and Greg's relationship. They have to communicate because they cannot afford to remain emotionally distant. The world outside is too dangerous. There is no room for meaningless arguments, there is only the question of what matters. This creates some of the movie's most human moments. Instead of asking whether Greg is right or Denise is right, the film gradually asks whether they can stop keeping score. A marriage cannot survive if every disagreement becomes a competition. The crisis forces them to remember why they were together in the first place. The dinosaurs therefore become a strange form of relationship therapy, and yes, that is a ridiculous sentence, but it is also basically what the movie is doing. A prehistoric disaster is the worst couples counselor imaginable, and somehow it works. This is where the film's humor becomes valuable. There are moments when the situation is so absurd that the movie needs to acknowledge it. The filmmakers do not constantly make jokes, but there is a sense of irony underneath the story. Yeah, a normal suburban family suddenly has to think about things like predator behavior, prehistoric geography, and survival. Imagine being worried about paying your mortgage one day and worrying about an Allosaurus the next. That is the kind of contrast that makes the movie naturally funny. The internet has already embraced that side of the concept. One of the easiest memes is the idea of a suburban homeowner saying, "At least the HOA can't complain about my lawn anymore." While a dinosaur stands behind the house, another joke practically writes itself around the title. Finally, the city fixed the traffic problem on Oak Street. There is no traffic because Oak Street no longer exists in the normal world. Another meme could be neighbor who keeps making that noise at 3 a.m. Me, probably the dinosaurs. These jokes may seem silly, but they show why the movie has strong social media potential. The premise is instantly understandable. You do not need to explain the entire plot before making a joke. One image of a dinosaur standing beside a suburban house is enough, and that is valuable in the modern movie business. A film does not only live through trailers and television commercials anymore, it lives through clips, memes, reaction videos, TikTok posts, YouTube reviews, Facebook discussions, people sharing screenshots. A strange premise can become free advertising. And the end of Oak Street has a premise people want to talk about. The marketing team also benefited from the fact that audiences were already familiar with Anne Hathaway and Ewan McGregor. Both actors bring credibility to a project that might otherwise sound too strange for a major studio release. Imagine the same movie starring two completely unknown actors. Would audiences have been as interested? Maybe. But Hathaway gives the project immediate recognition. Her name tells viewers that this is not a cheap creature movie. McGregor adds another level of credibility, and J.J. Abrams' involvement adds curiosity. David Robert Mitchell adds a reputation for unusual filmmaking. Michael Giacchino adds prestige to the music. Together, those names make the project feel much larger than its premise. That is one reason the movie's development is such an interesting Hollywood story. A director known for psychological horror, a major actress, a famous producer, a beloved composer, an original screenplay, a secretive production, a dinosaur concept, a 1980s setting, and a delayed release. All of those ingredients created a movie that audiences were curious about long before they knew exactly what it was. And curiosity is one of the most powerful forces in cinema. People want to understand what they are seeing. They want answers. They want to know why the street disappeared. They want to know where the family went. They want to know whether the dinosaurs are connected to the cosmic event. They want to know whether Greg survives. They want to know whether the family gets home. That curiosity keeps the movie moving. Even if the viewer is not completely convinced by the science, they still want to know what happens next. And that is a sign of effective storytelling. A technically perfect movie can still be boring. A scientifically imperfect movie can still be exciting. What matters is whether the audience wants to keep watching. The end of Oak Street generally succeeds on that level. The film also benefits from not trying to explain everything in its marketing. The trailers showed enough to sell the concept but kept many details hidden. That allowed the theatrical experience to contain genuine surprises in an era when trailers often reveal entire movies. That is refreshing. The best trailer for this movie is almost the concept itself. A neighborhood disappears, a family is trapped. Dinosaurs appear, what happens next? You have to watch, and perhaps that is the best way to approach the movie. Do not expect it to be the next Jurassic Park, do not expect it to be a perfect time travel thriller. Do not expect every scientific question to receive a detailed answer. Instead, expect a strange family adventure with dinosaurs, mystery, nostalgia, and emotion. If you go in with those expectations, the movie becomes much easier to appreciate. The strongest part is the combination of genres. The weakest part is also the combination of genres. Some people will love the way the movie moves from family drama to horror to adventure to comedy. Others will feel that the movie cannot decide what it wants to be. That is probably the biggest criticism of the film. It wants to be many things at once: a nostalgic family movie, a creature thriller, a science fiction mystery, a relationship drama. A comedy, an emotional story about grief. Sometimes those pieces fit perfectly, sometimes they collide. But even when the movie is uneven, it is rarely boring. And that counts for something. There is always another strange image, another mystery. Another dinosaur, another family argument, another emotional moment. The movie keeps moving. And that makes it much easier to forgive its imperfections. One of the biggest surprises is how much emotional weight the final act carries. After all the jokes and spectacle, the story becomes surprisingly sincere. Greg's apparent death forces Denise to confront how much she still cares about him. The children lose their sense of security. The possibility of never returning home becomes real. The movie stops being a fun dinosaur adventure and becomes a story about loss. That emotional shift is risky, but Hathaway sells it, McGregor sells it. The children sell it, and the music supports it. Suddenly, the audience remembers that these characters have spent the entire movie fighting for their lives. They are exhausted, they are frightened, they have changed. And when they finally have the possibility of returning to their normal world, that normal world no longer feels ordinary. It feels like a gift. That is the emotional trick at the center of the movie. The filmmakers make the audience miss normal life. At the beginning, normal life may seem boring. By the end, normal life feels beautiful. A backyard, a family meal, a familiar street, a quiet night. Those things become more valuable because the characters lost them, and that is a message almost everyone can understand. Sometimes you do not know what you have until it disappears. The dinosaurs simply give that lesson a much bigger scale. The final return, therefore, feels less like a victory over prehistoric monsters and more like a return to humanity. The family survives because they choose each other, and that may be the simplest and most effective message in the entire movie. When everything else disappears, people matter, not money, not houses, not technology, not status. People, family, love. The movie may wrap that message inside dinosaurs and cosmic science fiction, but the message itself is timeless. And that is probably why the film has connected with some critics despite its unusual premise. It is easy to dismiss the movie as the dinosaur neighborhood film, but there is more going on underneath. The best genre movies often work that way. They use fantasy to talk about real emotions. A monster can represent fear. A haunted house can represent trauma, a time machine can represent regret, and in this case, dinosaurs represent the terrifying unpredictability of life. The world can change without warning, your plans can disappear. Your future can look completely different overnight. The only thing you can control is how you respond. That is what Denise and Greg learn, and that is why the movie's final message feels hopeful. Life may destroy your plans. But that does not mean the story is over. Sometimes the end of one street is the beginning of another road, and perhaps that is the real meaning of the title. Oak Street ends, the family begins again. By the time the end of Oak Street reaches its final stretch, the movie has already done something that seemed almost impossible when the project was first announced. It has taken a quiet suburban street, a troubled family, a mysterious cosmic event, and prehistoric animals, and turned all of them into one story about home. That is why the final act works better if you think about the movie emotionally instead of scientifically. You can spend hours arguing about how the neighborhood moved through time, what caused the event, whether the physics make sense, and exactly how the characters managed to return. But the emotional question is much simpler. Can this family survive what has happened to them, and can they become a family again after everything they have lost? That question is what drives the last part of the movie. The journey has changed Denise more than anyone else. At the beginning, she is already tired. She is dealing with a marriage that has become difficult, children who need her attention, and the ordinary pressure of everyday life. She does not begin the movie looking for an adventure. She would probably be perfectly happy if the most exciting thing that happened that week was a family dinner without an argument. Instead, the universe takes her normal life away and forces her into a situation where every decision could mean life or death. Anne Hathaway understands that transformation and plays it gradually. Denise does not suddenly become a superhero. She becomes stronger because she has no choice. Every time something goes wrong, she has to keep moving. Every time she becomes frightened, she has to hide that fear long enough to protect her children. That makes her one of the more believable modern movie mothers because her strength comes from desperation rather than confidence. Ewan McGregor's Greg follows a different path. He begins the movie as a flawed man who is not necessarily the easiest person to like. His relationship with Denise has problems, and there are moments when it feels like the two of them may not be able to repair what has been damaged. But once the neighborhood is transported into the prehistoric world, Greg starts to see what he could lose. That realization becomes increasingly important. He is not simply fighting dinosaurs. He is fighting for the possibility of having a family to return to. His relationship with Denise becomes more important precisely because he realizes that there may not be a tomorrow. That is something the movie handles surprisingly well. A disaster does not magically fix a marriage, but it can force people to recognize what they have been taking for granted. That is why the scene involving the Allosaurus carries so much weight. On paper, it is exactly what audiences expect from a dinosaur survival movie. A giant predator appears, the characters are trapped, and someone has to make a sacrifice. But the emotional context changes everything. Greg's decision is not just about survival, it is about responsibility. He knows what he is risking. He knows that if he does not act, Denise and the children may die. For a character who has spent much of the movie struggling with his family, the decision becomes a defining moment. He may not have been the perfect husband, but he chooses to protect them when it matters most. The fact that the filmmakers originally considered making that death permanent is one of the most interesting details about the production. It is easy to imagine a completely different movie where Greg does not return. In that version, the ending would probably have been remembered as tragic rather than hopeful. Denise would have survived with the children, but the family would have returned home incomplete. The audience would have been forced to accept that the prehistoric journey changed their lives forever. The final version chooses something softer. Greg's apparent death becomes a temporary loss rather than a permanent one. That choice changes the emotional message from sometimes survival comes with an irreversible price to sometimes people deserve another chance. Both ideas could have worked, but the second one fits the movie's overall tone better. This is also where some of the criticism surrounding the ending makes sense. A few viewers may feel that bringing Greg back removes some of the emotional risk. If the movie spends so much time making the audience believe that he has died and then reverses the outcome, the sacrifice can feel less permanent. Some people prefer stories that allow consequences to remain consequences. They may argue that the original ending would have been braver. Others will say that the final version is exactly what the movie needs because it is ultimately a hopeful family adventure. There is no objectively correct answer. It depends on what you want from the story. For me, the interesting part is that the movie gives us both emotions. We experience the fear of losing Greg before discovering that he may not be gone forever. The emotional pain is still real because Denise does not know what the audience eventually learns. From her perspective, the loss is devastating. Her reaction matters even if the story later gives her a second chance. That is why Hathaway's performance during these scenes is so important. She has to play grief before the audience knows whether the grief will become permanent. The movie also uses silence very effectively during these emotional scenes. Instead of filling every moment with dialogue, it sometimes allows characters to simply look at each other. That is a technique Mitchell has used throughout his career. He understands that people do not always explain their emotions out loud. Sometimes the audience can understand what is happening from a face, a pause, or the way someone moves. This makes the film feel more mature than its premise might suggest. The same approach can be seen in the relationship between Denise and her children. Denise does not always know what to say. She cannot promise them everything will be okay because she does not know if it will be. That is one of the most realistic parts of the movie. Parents in disaster films often say things like, everything is going to be fine, even when the audience knows it will not be. Here, the uncertainty feels more honest. Denise is scared too, she just cannot afford to stop. That creates an emotional bond between the family members. They are all frightened, but they become stronger together. The children began to understand that their parents are not invincible. The parents began to understand that their children can handle more than they expected. The crisis changes everyone. Nobody returns to normal exactly as they were. This is why the prehistoric setting works as more than a backdrop. The dinosaurs are not simply obstacles placed between the family and the ending. They represent the unpredictable world around them. The family has to learn to observe their environment. They need to understand which creatures are dangerous, where they can hide, and how they can move without attracting attention. The survival scenes therefore have a natural rhythm. The characters learn from their mistakes. The film's creature work becomes especially effective when it emphasizes animal behavior rather than turning every dinosaur into a monster. The creatures are not evil, they are hungry, territorial, or simply curious. That makes them more believable. The characters are the outsiders. They have entered an ecosystem that does not care about their problems. This idea creates one of the movie's strongest contrasts. The Platts spend much of their time worrying about their marriage and their family. The dinosaurs do not care. The prehistoric world continues regardless of human emotion. A family can have a heartbreaking argument while a giant creature is simply walking through the trees. Nature does not pause because someone is sad. That makes the environment feel enormous and indifferent. Michael Giacchino's score helps communicate that scale. His music often gives the prehistoric world a sense of wonder before turning that wonder into danger. This is important because dinosaurs should not always be frightening. There is also something beautiful about seeing animals that humans have only experienced through fossils, museums, and movies. The film occasionally allows the audience to simply look at them. Those moments remind us that the characters are witnessing something extraordinary even while they are terrified. That balance between wonder and fear is one of the movie's best qualities. A dinosaur can be beautiful from a distance and terrifying when it starts running toward you. The same environment can feel magical one moment and deadly the next. That emotional instability keeps the movie interesting. The cinematography supports this by frequently making the prehistoric environment feel much larger than the neighborhood. Houses may remain standing, but the world around them has changed completely. Trees are taller, the landscape stretches farther, the sky feels more open. The characters are surrounded by nature in a way that modern suburban life normally prevents. That contrast makes the movie feel almost like a visual metaphor for leaving childhood behind. The safe little world has become enormous and frightening. That interpretation becomes even more interesting when you consider the 1980s setting. The movie is not only recreating a particular decade, it is recreating the feeling of a period when many people imagined suburbia as the center of family life. The house, the neighborhood, the school, the family car, and the backyard were symbols of stability. By removing that stability, the film asks whether those symbols actually matter when the people inside them are in danger. This is one reason the final return home feels different from the opening. At the beginning, the house is simply a house. At the end, it represents survival. The same walls have a completely different emotional meaning because the characters have changed. The audience has changed too. After watching them struggle through the prehistoric world, the ordinary neighborhood suddenly feels precious. That is an old storytelling trick, but it remains effective because it is human. If you take something away from people and then give it back, they appreciate it differently. The movie does that with almost everything. Family becomes more valuable. Home becomes more valuable. Time becomes more valuable. Even a boring dinner can become something worth celebrating. This is why the film's title has more meaning than it first appears. The end of Oak Street sounds like a disaster, but it can also describe the end of a period in the family's life. The old version of their family ends, a new version begins. The street itself becomes a symbol of change. The movie also plays with the idea that time is not just a scientific concept. Time is something people feel. Parents watch their children grow up. Couples remember when they were younger. People think about opportunities they missed. They wonder what they could have done differently. They imagine alternate versions of their lives. A literal time travel story gives those emotional ideas a physical form. Denise and Greg are essentially given an impossible second chance. They get to experience the kind of event that forces them to reconsider their relationship. And then the movie gives them another chance to live differently after returning home. In that sense, the ending is less about reversing the cosmic event and more about changing the people who experienced it. This is also why the movie does not need a complicated villain. There is no evil mastermind responsible for the dinosaurs. There is no secret organization controlling everything. There is no villain waiting in a laboratory to explain the mystery. The conflict is environmental and emotional. The characters are fighting nature, circumstance, and their own problems. That simplicity is refreshing. It also keeps the movie from becoming another franchise setup. There is no obvious need for a sequel. The story has a beginning, middle, and end. The characters experience something extraordinary and then return to their lives. That does not mean a sequel could never happen, especially if the movie becomes successful, but the story itself does not feel desperate to create one. That matters in 2026 because audiences are increasingly aware of when movies are trying to sell them the next movie before finishing the current one. The end of Oak Street mostly avoids that feeling. It wants the audience to care about this story first, and perhaps that is why the movie's original title, Flowervale Street, was such a useful piece of marketing. It sounded like an ordinary place. It did not immediately reveal the dinosaur concept. Once the title became The End of Oak Street, the new name gave the movie a stronger sense of danger. It sounded like something terrible had happened. The title itself became a question. What happened to Oak Street? Why is it the end? That kind of curiosity is useful for a movie like this because the premise is strange enough that you want people to wonder. The marketing also benefited from Anne Hathaway. She has enough star power to make the movie feel important, but she is not so associated with one specific franchise that audiences automatically know what to expect. That makes her an effective lead for an original science fiction movie. People recognize her, but they cannot predict exactly what she will do. Ewan McGregor works in a similar way. Audiences know him from many different kinds of films, but he is not trapped in one genre. He can play dramatic characters, comedic characters, and action characters. That flexibility helps him fit into the movie's unusual tone. The younger cast members also bring energy that prevents the family scenes from feeling too adult. The children react differently to the situation, and their presence keeps reminding the audience that this is not simply about two adults trying to survive. The stakes involve an entire family, and then there is the supporting cast. Chris Coy, Jordan Alexa Davis, and PJ. Byrne help expand the world beyond the immediate family, giving the neighborhood a sense that these characters are part of a larger community. That is important because the title is about a street, not just a house. Oak Street is supposed to feel like a place where many lives exist together. The movie therefore begins with a community and gradually strips away that community. The characters become isolated. The more isolated they become, the more important their immediate family becomes. That is a clever progression. There is also something darkly funny about the idea of suburban community rules disappearing overnight. Before the cosmic event, people probably worry about parking, noise, property boundaries, trash cans, and lawns. After the event, none of that matters. A dinosaur does not care whether your grass is too long. It does not care whether your house is painted the correct color. It does not care if you parked in front of someone's driveway. The apocalypse is the ultimate solution to neighborhood arguments. That idea is perfect meme material. Imagine a neighbor walking over to complain about a loud party and seeing a dinosaur behind the house. Actually, never mind. Or someone complaining that their property value has gone down. Sir, there is literally a dinosaur outside. The movie's premise naturally invites that kind of humor, and social media has already embraced the absurdity. But the memes also reveal something about why the film is easy to market. People understand the joke immediately. The movie can be described in one sentence and still sound interesting. That is a huge advantage. A lot of science fiction movies require complicated explanations before anyone understands what they are about. This one does not. Your neighborhood gets sent to the dinosaur age. That's it. You are either interested or you are not. And for people who are interested, the movie delivers a surprisingly emotional experience. The box office, however, remains one of the biggest questions surrounding the film. Its opening weekend was respectable but not enormous, especially considering the reported $85 million budget. Early reports put the domestic opening at around $21 million and the worldwide opening around $47 million. AppNews.com, those numbers put the film in an interesting position. It does not look like a giant failure, but it also does not look like a runaway blockbuster. The movie needs audiences to keep showing up. Strong word of mouth could help. The critics' score could help. The fact that the film is an original property could also help if audiences are looking for something different from franchise movies. But the competition is serious. The film opened alongside major established brands and had to fight for attention during a crowded summer movie season. That is difficult for any original film. Audiences have limited money and limited time. If someone can choose between a famous superhero character, a giant franchise sequel, and an original movie about a suburban street transported to the dinosaur age, the original film has to work harder to convince them. That is why the critical response matters. A good review can make someone curious. A friend saying, I actually loved it, can be even more powerful. The movie's future may therefore depend heavily on word of mouth. If audiences describe it as a fun, emotional surprise, it can continue attracting people. If people describe it as confusing or predictable, the theatrical run may slow quickly. The final box office total is therefore still unknown, and it would be misleading to pretend that the film's financial story is already finished. It has only just entered theaters, and its performance will continue changing over the coming weeks. What we can say already is that the movie has created conversation, and conversation is valuable. People are talking about the ending, people are talking about the dinosaurs, people are talking about the 1980s setting. People are talking about the strange premise. People are talking about the fact that J.J. Abrams produced it. People are talking about Anne Hathaway fighting prehistoric animals. People are talking about Ewan McGregor's apparent death.